Thank you. I think we all know how generous Edwin is, and I think if I've learned one thing during these days here at Misano, it's to appreciate Edwin's, total availability, hospitality in every way, and generosity. So thank you, Edwin. I'd like to begin actually by congratulating Siri on the journal that you were telling us about, and I was so impressed when I received the journal in the mail, and I feel it's truly innovative. It's really a different journal. It's different from the others in its themes, in its presentation, and in its ambitions, which are truly remarkable. So congratulations for bringing it this far, and the baby will grow up, and I will speak into the microphone. And I've made it an executive decision. I had a meeting with myself this morning, and I decided that I'm going to change the order of the lectures. So in order to give a kind of a more optimistic finish, I'm going to talk today about Nicosia and take on the question of intractable borders, opening onto, as I said, a somewhat, the edges of empire will be on Friday. On September 20th, 2008, an unusual open-air performance took place on the banks of the river Neretva in Bosnia. With the famous bridge of Mostar as the backdrop, a troupe from South Africa staged the play Truth in Translation to a large audience. The play is about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular tells the stories of the interpreters as they react to the testimonies they must repeat with their own voices. The subject is troubling, but with excellent acting and compelling music, the performance had a stunning impact. I actually was able to see it in Edinburgh. So Mostar is just one of the many symbolic sites where the play has been staged since it was conceived in South Africa in 2001 and premiered in 2006. The play has been performed in conventional venues, like the Edinburgh Festival, but mainly in a series of zones of violence from Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and Northern Ireland to Sweden and the Balkans. There could hardly be a more eloquent site than the Mostar Bridge. Here I'm going to try to... As both a monument to violence and a symbol of reconciliation, the bridge was more than a setting or a prop. It was an echo of the themes of the play. Translation, as we know, has long been figured as a bridge. Here, the relationship was literalized, as images of the play were projected onto the walls of the bridge during the performance, images which allowed subtitles to be added and therefore actually became the surfaces of translation. Truth in Translation is a powerful exploration of the role of the interpreter in cases where the material is emotionally charged. In the case of the commission, the interpreters were often young and untested, and they were obliged to become the voices of victim and perpetrator. So here you see, can you see it actually? Okay. Of both victim and perpetrator. They were forced to say I. Everything flowed through them, lies and truths, forgiveness and rage, pain and celebration. Their mandate was not to become involved, yet under the intense emotional pressure of the hearings, the difficult working conditions, the fact that they traveled constantly, many of the interpreters started showing symptoms of stress. The interpreter was the sponge who absorbed all the pain during the entire process, is one of the comments of the interpreter. At each performance site over the years, the performance have organized workshops and discussions, and you can see that, I think, more at the beginning of the slideshow, you saw some of the discussions. And this was done in Mostar too, where, of course, issues of violence and reconciliation have evident resonance. Mostar joins a handful of cities around the world that have been physically divided through conflict. I'll just play that again so you can see those images again. Berlin, Jerusalem, Gorizia, others with the moving barriers of conflict, volatile lines of demarcation, Mostar, Beirut, Belfast. The prominence of Mostar as a site of division during the Yugoslav conflict of 1992 to 1995 was enhanced by the stark visual power of the Mostar Bridge. The destruction of this ancient Ottoman bridge in 1993, built in 1566, epitomized the violence that separated Croatian and Bosniak communities. The notion that the former Yugoslavia was being forcibly unmade found graphic representation in the assault on a bridge literally linking East and West, Muslim and Croat. The final collapse of the single-span stone bridge into the river was captured on video by local news media and broadcast around the world. Once the 18th-month siege was lifted, the city was divided into two camps, West Mostar and East Mostar. Though the Dayton Accords brought the conflict to an end, the situation in Mostar to this day remains strained. Mostar remains a divided city, a caricature of a city, in fact, with separate administrative authorities for ambulance services, with contradictory street directions given on different sides of the river. The ancient Ottoman bridge, I'll go back to that now. I thought, I guess. Sorry, I have to, can somebody put me back into slideshow? Thank you. The ancient Ottoman bridge was rebuilt at a cost of $15 million under the aegis of UNESCO with funding from the European Union and officially inaugurated in 2004. But although the bridge has been rebuilt, the trust between the various communities in Mostar remains damaged. As Rita Kotari writes about the Nehru Bridge in her own city of Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat after the riots of 2002, the bridge does not bridge as bridges are supposed to. It is another division in a city divided along the lines of caste, class, religion, and gender. Divided cities are aberrations. When cities had walls, these walls were protections against attack from without. But partitions divide cities against themselves. So I want to move now to another divided city, Nicosia, the capital city of the island of Cyprus, known as the last divided capital of Europe. For some reason, they seem to take pride in this designation, which of course seems like not something one would wish. Now, Cyprus, a place which had little place in international news for decades, suddenly shot into the international news last month as the latest flashpoint in the Eurozone bailout saga. What I've noticed in the coverage of the Cyprus crisis is that there is little or no mention of the fact that a part of Cyprus is in Turkish hands, except in relation to the question of the natural gas reserves that will have to be developed jointly by the two parts of the island. Indeed, in a 6-minute video posted online promoting Nicosia as a candidate for European Capital of Culture 2017, there is only the briefest flash of the border and no other mention of the division of the island. In general, Cyprus, for the world, is simply Greek Cyprus, the part of the island that is a member of the European Union. Yet the division of the island remains not only a source of political tension, but immense sadness and frustration on the island. It is not only the island that's divided, but most dramatically, the city of Nicosia. These are what maps of Nicosia look like. You get them from either one side or from the other. So it's like weather maps when you're in a country, you know, where America's cut off at the Canadian border. Canadian weather includes the US, by the way, but not the opposite. In any case, this is Nicosia, where you see only the Greek side. Again, you will have maps that show you only one half. Nicosia is a city divided across its center by the Green Line, drawn in 1974, and by the area known as the Dead Zone, that covers a few desolate blocks of rusting barbed wire and pockmarked houses. The checkpoint which controls access across the city is ironically situated on a street called Hermes. Why ironic? The Greek messenger god was revered for his help in all kinds of boundary crossings, yet the street in Nicosia is more like an impasse, which has for an entire generation cut the city into two non-communicating entities. Hermes Street itself was a recent creation, built during the 1880s by the British administrators of Cyprus over the river that once flowed through the city, just to continue that theme, but which had become polluted. Hermes Street became a major commercial axis and a trading zone, bringing together the diverse populations of the city. As the capital of a Mediterranean island occupied by a succession of rulers, from the Lusignan kings and the Venetians to the Ottomans and the British, Nicosia has always been a place of cultural mixtures and overlays. I'll just show you these images of the Dead Zone. That store is, I don't know what that store is, but as the capital of a Mediterranean island occupied by a succession of rulers, the city has always been a place of mixtures and overlays, and the most striking visual representation of this hybridity is the former Cathedral of St. Sophia, a Gothic structure converted into a mosque. I have never seen another Gothic structure converted into a mosque. If anyone has, I'd be interested to know. You get a few views of it. It's a very strange combination. And that's the name of the mosque. But the busy and cosmopolitan Hermes Street, also a strong symbol of Cyprus's culture of contact, was turned into a political boundary, as I said, in 1974, with the stroke of United Nations pencil, becoming a portion of the Green Line separating Greek from Turkish Cyprus. The transition from a place of contact to a place of separation is not as contradictory as it might seem, and indeed we mentioned that last time in the discussion, where we were talking about this very imbricated relationship between contact and separation that happens in translation. Because the area was never firmly imprinted with one single ethnic identity, it belonged to neither side. And so according to the logic of the political rivalries of the time, the most diverse and convivial territory would become the deadened border zone. The line that divides Nicosia is also a linguistic fault line. While the language divides of other cities are continually being redefined, becoming ever more porous as identities are reinterpreted, the linguistic geography of Nicosia is cruelly immobile. Moira Killoran speaks of a cryogenic freezing of space and time, where the concept of history itself has become as frozen as the border. A solid barrier separates Turkish from Greek, as surely as it puts distance between the sumptuous ancient stone market and caravanserai in the north and the modern concrete buildings of the south. What kind of exchange is possible across a line which restricts mobility? This is the question that I will try to explore in the rest of this lecture. What does it mean to see the city as a translation space, and what can the atypical urban space of Nicosia tell us about the possibilities of translation? The city, as you know, has been the object of a great deal of influential writing and theorization since the 1980s. Authors such as David Harvey, Saskia Sassen, Edward Soja, Alan Bloom, Richard Sennett, Ian Chambers have made the city the focus of issues of democracy and community, focusing on cities as a privileged arena for the expression of citizenship and as a focus of engagement and belonging. Language, however, an essential instrument and domain of the public, the medium through which public discussion takes place, has, however, simply been taken for granted. Despite the sensory evidence of multilingualism in today's cities, the proliferation of scripts on storefronts, the shouted conversations on cell phones, there has been little more than casual reference to language as a vehicle of urban cultural memory, or as of translation as a key in the creation of meaningful spaces of contact and civic participation. And there is little sustained discussion of language and language interactions as a feature of a city's identity. This oversight is particularly striking as cities face the challenge of promoting translation that will ensure urban cohesion, much as Siri was talking about. Translation is the key to citizenship, to the incorporation of languages into the public sphere. And this means seeing multilingual, multi-ethnic urban space as a translation space, where the focus is not on multiplicity, but on interaction. I've explored this premise in some recent work on what I call dual cities, cities that because of their histories are more intensely translational than others. In dual cities, two historically established communities both lay claim to the territory, and both languages dispute dominance. But there are many patterns of the translational city, where language frictions define a fractured civic space. From the cities of the Levant, Beirut, Alexandria, Istanbul, to those of erstwhile Mitteleuropa, Trieste, Czernowitz, Vilnius, Lviv, from the cities of European colonization, Kolkata or Dakar, to regional capitals of multilingual nations, Barcelona, Montreal. A geometry emerges of divided and contested space, where language relations are regulated by the opposing forces of coercion and resistance, of willful indifference and engaged interconnection. As models of plurality, all such cities provide insights into the evolution of today's global cosmopolis, contributing to an understanding of meaningful interaction among diverse communities, and heightening awareness of the precariousness of coexistence. It's not simply the presence of languages that count, but the memories which direct the flow of language traffic, the mood which animates life at the intersection, as well as the individuals who flick the switches of language tracks across the city, actors in the life of the city whose interventions as translators or self-translators create new paths of communication across the city. It's important to remember that the figure of the translator can complicate ideas of belonging, that she can have a role not in reproducing boundaries, but in introducing cultural shifts, in initiating new routes of language exchange, and reorienting the terms of citizenship. These shifts make the intersection the symbolic center of the city's imaginative life, as a site of opportunity and danger, of hopeful encounters and disappointed miscommunication. The power of translation is a theme deeply embedded in Cyprus history. Strategically located at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the island has seen a succession of cultures, and various configurations of coexistence have been inscribed in the island's history. Since ancient times, Cyprus has been annexed by every ruling empire in the region. It was conquered by the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Lusignans, and the Venetians. In 1571, the Ottomans gained control and held it until British rule began in 1878. Translation took on a particularly potent form during Ottoman times, in the sense that the position of dragoman was one of great power. Just over the border on the Turkish side, one can visit the home of Hagi Gorgakis Kornisios, the legendary Christian dragoman, who, this is his house, who represented the Ottoman Empire in Cyprus from 1779 to 1809. That's a street named after him. The fact that Kornisios' life came to a bloody end through a beheading in Istanbul testifies to the prestige, but of course also the danger associated with the august designation of dragoman during the period of the Sublime Porte. A street bears his name, as you saw, and his mansion is one of the most impressive residential buildings left from the Ottoman era. That's a fuzzy picture, as I remember. So, literary modernity came belatedly to Cyprus when in the 1880s British colonialism introduced the first newspaper and Alexandrian Greeks gave the island its first printing press. The period 1880 to 1930 under British rule saw a flurry of literary activity, including translation. Translation included classic and contemporary European literature, as well as Eastern literature, mainly Arabic and Persian. And Cypriots studying both in Cyprus and in British universities were important catalysts in the literary activity among diaspora in Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Levant, and in this translation activity. Thus, the foundation of literary modernity in Cyprus in the early 20th century was, according to Stefanos Stefanides, transnational and translational. Modern-day translators recall Cyprus's heritage as a meeting place in the Mediterranean and as a place where learning was preserved and promoted through translation. Today, in cultural centers on both sides of the divide, artists and writers meet to perpetuate this tradition and to revive the memory of distinctively Cypriot forms of language and identity. Despite the bell jar of political pressure, they struggle to maintain lines of linguistic mobility, to reanimate the texts and memories of a time when languages could move freely across the territory. So, a divided present against the backdrop of a mixed and plural past. This is the kind of contradiction that suits Hermes, with whom we started. Hermes is the mythical overlord of crossroads. For centuries, he stood as a physical presence at crucial crossing points. Herms were initially heaps of stones used to indicate boundaries. The Greeks and Romans turned these heaps into forms of statuary, the heads and torsos of a god, usually Hermes, but also Dionysus, standing on a tapered pediment. Hermes is therefore the god of both separation and connection. He protects boundaries, but through his magical powers also provides safe passage for travelers. Since the opening of checkpoints in 2004, allowing access across the city, Hermes is able to exercise both facets of his powers. Messenger and trickster, trader and thief, Hermes is also hermeneut, an inquiring mind, an interpreter of texts, and a mediator across languages. His special role is to remind us that these activities and understanding and interpretation are made possible by the cultural realities of place. And so he introduces us to the city as an environment which favors certain language trajectories and discourages others. By highlighting the interrelations of language and space that sustain urban life, Hermes provides the defining terms for the study of languages and cities. Standing on the boundary between the Greek and Turkish sectors, Hermes defines Nicosia as a space once defined by intense activities of exchange, but whose passages today are regulated by the social forces of antagonism, or should I say the political forces. These forces do not make translation impossible, but they give an inevitable tonality to any transactions would take place, a mood. In a situation like that of Cyprus, language takes on its full potential as a vehicle of memory. The anthropologist Yael Navarro-Yashin writes of the affective geography of post-conflict Cyprus from 1974 to 2004, describing the way daily life on both sides of the divide was saturated with emotion, expressed, contained, repressed. The experience of spatial confinement, of the abandoned and derelict spaces around the border areas, of the ruins, rust, dust, and garbage that proliferate there, of occupying the houses of those who were forcibly relocated. These have an undeniable effect on today's Cypriots. For Navarro-Yashin, the ruined environment transmits affective energy. We don't go there, say many inhabitants of Turkish Cyprus, referring to the derelict zones, perhaps expressing the desire to keep distant a memory of violence. Similarly, Turkish Cypriots have to live in the knowledge that the houses they occupy are not legally theirs, and that many of the objects with which they have furnished their homes were pilfered from confiscated property. By contrast with the ambiguities and conflicts of these elements of daily life, the relation to language is simple and emphatic, pointing to a shared belief in the univocal single interpretation of the past. It's absolutely necessary to align oneself with one language or the other, to call places by the names which have been assigned to them, streets, villages, and to avoid the mixed language forms which were formerly associated with typically Cypriot forms of expression. This alignment with national language continually reaffirms language as a marker of identity, in the same way as language calls attention to itself on the street corners of Montreal or Barcelona, cities likewise traversed by internal divisions. This persistent reaffirmation of language as a performative marker of identity increases the fraught nature of translation. Indeed, when translations take place among communities that share the same territory, the same geographical and cultural references, the social effects of translation are enhanced. And when languages are privileged markers of identity, then the social effect of translation is restricted to what I call distancing. So I'm coming back to what I mentioned the other day. Let me explain this term. Distancing is what happens when translations serve to underscore the differences that prevail among cultures and languages, even when the gap may be the small distances of urban space. Distancing occurs when authors are treated as representatives of their origins, of their national or religious traditions, when translation is undertaken for ideological reasons, either in a mood of antagonism, of generosity, or simply of politeness. Distancing has the same affective force as tolerance. It is a regime of managing difference, not of changing the terms of engagement. In situations of conflict, as Mahmoud Kayal has argued in the context of Hebrew-Arabic translation, literary translation will only partly be a vehicle for fruitful intercultural dialogue and will be drawn into the arena of struggle between political and ideological viewpoints. This does not mean that translations are ineffective or futile. It simply means that the context in which they are produced is an overwhelming influence on the way they are received. And so, for instance, over and above the literary value of the work itself, it would be hard to ignore the circumstances under which translations of poetry from Arabic in a divided Jerusalem are undertaken. There is a necessary acknowledgement of the divides out of which they emerge and of the exceptional nature of translators as go-betweens. The opposite is what I call furthering. Furthering involves what Edith Grossman calls the revivifying and expansive effect of translation. One language infusing another with influences, alterations, and combinations that would not have been possible without the presence of translated foreign literary styles and perceptions. The material significance and heft, this is her term, of literature, I like that, the heft of literature that lies outside the territory of the purely monolingual. Furthering is a warmer form of interaction, more volatile, allowing for the possibility of creating hybrid forms more similar to a leap than to a bridge, to use Willem Flusser's terms. Distancing, then, is the expression of the gulfs which separate languages and cultures. Furthering is a vehicle of aesthetic interactions and blendings. Furthering involves the rerouting of cultural translations. And I have two examples, but I think I will leave them for, these are my two examples. I'll leave them for later if we have time. Back to Nicosia then. What kind of translation can take place across the dividing lines of Cyprus? Does a situation like that which prevails in Nicosia mean that distancing as a form of translation is the only possible mode of negotiation across the border? According to Bekir Azgin, while there have been significant interchanges in the area of popular culture, there has traditionally been little interest between the two sides in the area of high culture. But paradoxically, he says, after physical separation, there was a new desire on both sides to learn about the other. And in fact, poetry readings began in 1979, regular events organized, and even poetry recitations on the Green Line with a dozen poets from each side. But this is clearly a very politically marked kind of poetry reading. This same politicization can be seen in the translating practices of a journal such as Cadences, a journal published by the University of Cyprus, which publishes high-quality work by both established poets and critics as well as students, and frequently features poetry translated from Greek to Turkish and the contrary, as well as into English. I'll just read you the editorial statement. Cadences is a multilingual literary magazine publishing poetry, short fiction, autobiography, etc., in the languages of Cyprus. Writers in Cyprus think, feel, and express themselves in several languages, Greek, Turkish, and English being three of the most prominent. Cadences is a bridge between them, a meeting point at which the writers of the diverse communities of the island may find each other and learn from their encounters. So this is, in a sense, the kind of positive maneuver, obviously excellent initiative, but one which remains within the categories that are in some ways predetermined. The journal regularly includes a mélange of Greek, Turkish, and English, but the pluralism evoked by that objective stands in contrast to the prevailing ideologies of the island. However, the plurilingual policies of the journal, while aiming at conversation across the divides, are not in themselves an indication of successful interconnection. In fact, though they promote communication and surely play a role in creating encounters on both sides, they all the same reproduce the logic of representationality that sustains both translation and political conflict. That is, they foreground difference and are therefore implicated in a logic of distancing. So here I'd like to turn to the poetic practices of the Turkish Cypriot poet Mehmet Yashin, practices that point to perhaps a more effective form of interlingual communication, one which tries to work against these inevitable forces of distancing. So Mehmet Yashin was born, this by the way is Mehmet Yashin's sister, who is also a very prominent poet in Cyprus and who's become almost a national symbol, having written a poem which says, you know, there are two parts of Cyprus, which part am I supposed to love, or how is my heart? And this has become apparently a refrain so popular that it's become almost a national anthem. So she is an important poet in her own right, but I would like to speak of her brother here, Mehmet Yashin. He was born in Nicosia in 1958, in a part of in the Turkish part of what has become the Turkish part of Nicosia, and has been able to actually return there, and his family now does live in Nicosia. Turkish is his mother tongue, and this language still remains the main means of his literary writing. Yet throughout Yashin's oeuvre, both in his literary works and in his essays, he reveals the precarious ability of a mother tongue to encompass and convey multiple identities and different cultural belongings, and conversely, the impossibility of any mother tongue to coincide with or be kept within the bounds of the often arbitrary national borders of its motherland. So Mehmet Yashin has written of the stepmother tongue. He says, mother tongue is relative, multiple, and shifting. And what I would like to propose is that there is a step quality latent in it. Language is stepmother by its very nature. Individuals are born into languages they have not themselves created, and which cannot express human beings totally. Particularly writing languages, as the basic element of literature, does not come to life from a natural mother, but is precisely geared to create the sense of a mother in the context of fictionalized national histories. The steppe tongues, which have enforced themselves as so-called mother tongues, particularly through literary works on particularly communities, are the primary forces that attach individuals to a modern sense of national belonging, recreating an imaginary notion of us. So that was all Mehmet Yashin. So here, Yashin takes a firm stand against Cyprus's most recent history, where linguistic identities have increasingly become ethnically identified and politically charged. He reminds us how conflict zones such as Cyprus, crossed by contested political boundaries, inevitably involves political consequences. The resolute indeterminacy of the poet in choosing his language of expression can be seen, therefore, as an extreme act of revolt. He emphasizes, on the one hand, the different Turkishes that members of his family spoke, the Istanbuli Turkish of his father, the hyper-correct Turkish of his mother, the much more porous Turkish of his aunt. He actually speaks of his aunt tongue as well, the almost unaware and unceasing shifting from one language to another of his, an aunt who influenced him a great deal. But it's Yashin's edited collection called Stepmother Tongue, which is an attempt to revive and reinvigorate the long tradition of cultural and linguistic contact between multiple Turkishes and multiple Greeks. And he says, would it be an exaggeration to liken Greek and Turkish to step-siblings born in the former Byzantine Ottoman geographies, emphasizing, for example, the closeness between Pontic Greek and Black Sea Turkish, languages which both developed in the outside of, in the larger areas outside of today's national Greece. So now I'd like to just talk a little bit of give you two examples of what he actually does to try to mix languages up and to stay outside the bounds of the mother tongue. And one of the ways that he does this, which is extremely compelling, is by using in his poems a language form called Karaman Lidica, in which Greek characters were employed in writing Turkish. And I'm sorry that you don't see this here, because try as I might, and I did try several times, every time, whether I won't take you through the steps, but it kept translating itself out of the Greek characters. So what you see as nonsense words are actually Greek characters, okay? So imagine that where you see the asterisks were Greek characters. It looks, of course, more convincing when you see the Greek characters. So the Greek characters are actually spoken Turkish. Okay? So this was a form of spoken Turkish written in the Greek alphabet and used for many centuries as an unofficial language by Turkish-speaking Orthodox Greeks living in central Anatolia. Because you know that before the population exchange, the great population exchange of 1923, when Greeks and Turks were forcibly relocated, and when the nation of Greece was reconstituted after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and Turkey was that there were huge populations of Greeks living in what is today present-day Turkey, and many, many Turks living in what is considered today modern-day Greece. So the fact that they would write Turkish in Greek letters would make perfect sense. So this was a form of spoken Turkish written in the Greek alphabet and used for many centuries as an unofficial language by Turkish-speaking Orthodox Greeks living in central Anatolia, which eventually fell into disuse by the early 1930s, when most of members of this community were resettled in Greece as a result of the population exchange, that took place in 1923. The adoption of the Roman alphabet in Turkey no doubt played a part in this, but the practice continued in Cyprus somewhat later, until at least the later 30s. So Mehmet draws inspiration from this mixed form, which he reappropriates in his poetry. He also draws inspiration from another example of contamination to be found in Cyprus, a group of Turkish Cypriot folk poets who use in their literary language the Greek dialect of the island, constantly interweaving it with Turkish words and expressions of loanwords from other languages. So these traditions, using the contiguity and mingling of Turkish and Greek linguistic and cultural elements, are sources for Yashin's work. What he understands as a pre-national tradition. So Yashin's poetry, with its intrusions from other languages, with its hyper-consciousness of the plural identities of language, resembles what we might call unfinished translation. And so the English version of a Turkish poem containing words in Karamanlika cannot be an entirely English language poem either, but one which recalls at least part of its origins. And of course, this is a very beautiful poem about loss, and which conveys some of the ambiguities of his relationship to language as well. If I had not lost it, I would not have found it. If my mother hadn't died so young, I wouldn't have had to call her back to life, and I wouldn't have even noticed my father if he hadn't gone away, etc. I can let you read the rest. The poem is a sequence of flips, of shifting landscapes, which move from presence to absence and then back to presence. The mother, the father, the house, all have to disappear in order to regain presence, to become more real. If I had not lost it, I would not have found it. Language, we could argue, participates in the same kind of flip over, except it's not entirely certain which language is present and which is absent. Turkish is present in the form of Greek letters, but is the Greek only there to recall the absence of Turkish? Perhaps I would never have crossed the bounds of my inner self if I hadn't been exiled from the primordial paradise of poetry. For the poet, the relationship of self to language implies a sense of inner dividedness. Poetry is not the expression of native allegiance, but of much more tortuous passage through loss and exile. And here's a second poem which is even harder to decipher, because this is a poem which is decisively multilingual, and you are reading it in English translation. Translation by Linda Stark, in which you have combinations of all the varieties of languages are put together here. You have Greek and Turkish and the Karamanlidika, which is translated using both Greek and Turkish. What results is a hybrid text displaying translation effects, dissonances, interference, a certain weakness or deterritorialization. Hybridity takes on special importance in contexts where there is a heightened and historically anchored consciousness of cultural and linguistic mixing. Here, the hybrid text affirms the dividedness of identity, an expression of loss and disorientation, but also, in the original Turkish, a refusal to line up on one side or the other of the divide. The unfinished translation bears the mark of the relation which brought it into existence and of the relation which it desires to enact, a disengagement from the hegemony of the mother tongue, a refusal to allow his work to be translated in a way that maintains the gulf of national distance. Yashin refuses the adherence to a single national language that makes distancing possible by placing his allegiance first in the stepmother tongue, confounding the green line and its divides. And now I want to show you very briefly I'm going to show you just a few clips from a very, very interesting video that I only very recently became aware of. And this is a poetry translation workshop which was held in the space of the Dead Zone. Which illustrates for me what's interesting is the fact that this is not, I think I can contrast this to the poetry recital on the Green Line, which would have been a very political gesture of difference, whereas this is actually inhabiting the area of the Dead Zone and inhabiting it through translation. So I'm going to hope.
Okay, good. It is as if you have a double or a triple.
Histories may adjust themselves according to the historical moment. So, it's something dynamic. It's something that doesn't stand still.
Poetry is in itself always a kind of exile, but in the case of translation, it is as if you have a double or a triple level, of being foreign, so that sense of estrangeness, I think, feeling and not feeling in your own land, maybe it can also be applied to poetry.
Poems, they're organic and they are alive, and I see it as growing up. They are moving to, they are continuing their lives, and they live in another language, and okay, maybe they lose some music or some rhythms, but
I'm just going to go to the...
Fragmenty dyskursu miłosnego.
Sorry. Start there, please.
Remember how it was before there was separation, before there was segregation, because if they didn't, there was no need to keep a border.
Most of the people, they pass from here and they don't even realize that behind this wall is Victoria Street. Street that used to be one of the most important streets of the city. Back then, it was actually in the middle of the conflict. Now, of course, it's in the middle of what we call the dead zone.
Ήμουν στην οδός Βικτωρίας και γίνηκαν οι πρώτες φασαρίες και έφυγαν όλοι. Και το φυλάκιο δαμέ έφυγαν και έμπηκα εγώ μέσα. Με την τουρτούρα και έκλεπα. Όλη νύχτα, όλη μέρα. Έμεινα δαμέ. Πολλούς Τούρκους είχαν που είχαμε σχέσεις καλές ποδίες, ήταν όλοι φίλοι.
All right, I'm going to try one more place where you get a sense where this is the poet Stefanos Stefanides. These are poets who have come from various countries, and they're discussing translation at the same time as they are
The life to keep multiplying in its multiplicity of forms, coming to a decision where it's an awareness of the multiplicity of possibilities and the fact that we're actually making choices. Our own choices are influenced by our own hidden desires or the histories that have conditioned us that we don't even know.
Terra de ninguém. This is a made expression in Portuguese. Okay. It means the space between the borders. If into Greek appeared as something as the dead zone, and if the dead zone means terra de ninguém, that is no man's land. This part where everything can happen and nothing can happen, and continue to remind you of violation of rights, and it's continuously reminding you of the relations of power,
Yeah,
so I
domination.
think domination. And my poem is also about that, seen from a woman's point of view. It's in a way, it's a poem written by a woman too, Terra de ninguém. Digo espaço, ou uma receita qualquer que seja em vez.
She's quite wonderful, actually. These are very wonderful poets, and they're talking about the process of translation at the same time as they're inhabiting this space of the dead zone, and they really have converted they've really materialized through translation these moving spaces of the dead zone, and it just comes across as it uses the space to work through the uncertainties of translation. So this dead zone truly becomes a space between, not a border, but they're actually inhabiting this space, and they're making it into a space of translation. I find this extremely effective, and something which seems to me argues against notions of distancing, particularly, I think, because of this idea of the constant, and Stefano Stefanides just said that, the idea of movement and mobility, and the fact that this is a place of process rather than a place of product. I think that furthering has a lot to do with process, the idea that you know that you're engaged in a process, that you're that it's not a definitive end. So I'd just like to give another example of translation across the small spaces of the city, and refer to the Greek Cypriot, Yanis Papadakis, whose book, Echoes from the Dead Zone, is truly the tale of a singular translator who travels from his home in Cyprus, first to Istanbul to learn Turkish, and then to northern Cyprus before returning through the dead zone to his point of origin. He says of the language of Cypriots, our native tongue was neither the standard Greek nor the standard Turkish that we learned at school, but our own dialects. So here he promotes, again, a cutting across of these national boundaries. And here, just as a small note, I'll just come back to PowerPoint. I just want to add, just point out this very, very interesting project. Sorry. A very significant project undertaken by a journal called Trans-Européenne, and its director, Ghislaine Deschamps-Chiasson, which has a project to map out the real diffusion of translation in the Euro-Mediterranean region. Because here we've been talking about, what the relationship between Greek and Turkish on the border zone, but this is a most fascinating project. Covering the full range of interactions among the languages of the Mediterranean. So what actually is translated between Greek and Turkish, and what are the relationships between the two countries in terms of translations? And I invite you to investigate this very, very fascinating and unusual and unprecedented study of translation in the Mediterranean zone. So I will conclude very briefly then. Hermes, the ancient Greek god of traders, known as a thief, a trickster, a messenger, was also known as Psychopompus, the bearer of souls to Hades, for he could cross the most difficult boundaries, like the one between the living and the dead. That Hermes stands at the border of the dead zone in Nicosia is therefore appropriate in many ways. So far, Hermes' major contribution has been to ensure mutual cooperation and a concerted common action on the sewage system, a singular success story in a long-standing, bitter, and still unresolved conflict. But the place of Hermes at the border defines the intersection not only as a place of danger, but also of magical possibilities, a place where new forms of expression might be imagined, anticipating the moment when Nicosia will happily abandon its status as an aberration and return to its identity as a cosmopolitan city of mixed belongings. Thank you.